With the help of Hashem, we are learning PESACHIM Daf Samach Gimel. We are beginning the sugya on Daf Samach Beis Amid Beis, where the Gemara quotes a brisa, Acheidim Oimrim, that if when a person is shachting the Pesach, he says he intends Lamulim Villa Arelim, the brisa agrees with the Mishnah that even though the person also had in mind for Arelim, but this type of dual intent is okay, and the Korban Pesach remains kosher. But the opinion of Acheidim is that if the intent was first la'arelim and then lamulim, unlike our Mishnah that does not make a difference, does not differentiate, and in both cases the Mishnah holds the Pesach being kosher, Acheidim in the Brisa holds that the Korban is going to become puzzle, and we're going to start the daf today giving various approaches and understanding the underlying reason of Acheidim. As we mentioned, generally Acheidim is understood to be the shita of Rabbi Meir. We're going to learn about a concept, like we mentioned already in the intro to yesterday's daf, of whether Eino l'shchita el lebasoif or Yeshno l'shchita mitchila va'atsoif. We're going to be learning about the concept of whether bo'inan or loy bo'inan, piv v'liboy shavin, whether one's words and one's thoughts need to coincide or not. We're going to learn the shita of Rabbi Meir that mefalgin b'chatzi mater. Pigul literally means unclean or putrid. Pigul is the word that's used if there was a machsheves chutz lizman. There are times that in one step of the avodah itself, there are two parts. Just as an example, when you bring a korban mincha, so you have the 4 steps of the mincha is the kmitza. Second step, right, which corresponds to the Kabbalah, is nesina b'keli. Right? Then you have the hilacha, then you have the haktorah. Now it's interesting that the haktorah by the mincha isn't only the kemitza, it's the kemitza and the levoina. Both of them are considered one avodah. Each one is considered a part of. Now only after the kemitza is offered may the kohanim eat the shirayim. So the kemitza is called the mater. It permits the next step to happen. Being like we mentioned, the haktorah is kemitza and the levoina, both the flour and the frankincense. So each one is called a chatzi mater. Question is, if there was a machsheves chutz lizman only by one of them, whether that has the koyach to affect pigul, or ein mefaglin b'chatzi mater, and that's going to bring us back at the end to another insight into the shita of Acheidim, unlike the shita of our Tana in the Mishnah. On Daf Samach Gimel, we're going to begin with the new Mishnah. And we're going away from intentions that are not okay. Here we're going to focus on an Iser Da'iraisa. The Torah writes not once but twice, both in Mishpatim and in Kisisa. The pasuk in Kisisa reads, Lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. While you're shechting, one may not have chametz. Don't shech the korban on chametz. We're going to be understanding this pasuk according to the Mishnah in various ways, whether that's referring to shechting the korban Pesach, whether that's referring also to shechting the Tamid Shel Bein Ha'arbayim on Erev Pesach, the 14th in the afternoon, that chametz may not be owned. We will see who exactly may not own the chametz. What happens if someone did own the chametz? We're going to have the shita in the Mishnah of Rabbi Shimon that during Pesach, if let's say the owner owns chametz, aside of the owner violating Bal Yirah, Bal Yamatzah, any korban that's brought, according to Rabbi Shimon, not Erev Pesach, but on Pesach, also will be in violation of Lo Sishchat al Chametz Dam Zivchi. Then we're going to learn a nuance of what does al Chametz mean. How close must the Chametz be? Must the Chametz be in the Azara for there to be this violation, or wherever the Chametz is, it's owned by, we have a Machlekes Rabbi Yechanan and Rish Lakish, and that's going to lead us into many Hasra Safek, Shmei Hasra, whether the Haktada being brought, whether the burning of the Chalev while Chametz is owned, whether that is included in this Isur, whether that's not included in this Isur, and a lot more. So Chavra, let us start where we left off. So quickly recapping, we have in the Mishnah on Daf Samach Aleph that says that if there was a dual intent of lamulim villa arelim, no matter in which direction, which one was intended to first, it's always going to be kosher. Acheidim in the Brisa says, Lamulim v'larelim kosher. Arelim v'lamulim is not kosher. And the question will be as to why. So top of Daf Samach Gimel, so perhaps begin the first approach. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu malachenu shakal nivdoi. Lema kasavri acherim that eina l'shchita ella basoif. So we have this machlokes. Whether we say that the halachic shchita is from the beginning until the end, yeshna l'shchita mitchila va'ad soif. Now, what exactly happens during shchita? So there are two pipes, the trachea and the esophagus, that needs to be severed in the right way. Ideally, all of it, but you have it roiv, the majority of both of them. Do we view that the act of shchita is from the beginning of that cutting until the end? Or, as we're going to say that Rabbi Achedim, which is Rabbi Meir, holds that einoi l'shchita elo basoif, which means that everything that happens prior to coming to the last severance of the second pipe, when you hit that roiv, is all considered preliminary. It's needed to get there, but it's not considered part. It's not considered part of the act of the shchita, and therefore, any intention that needs to be had, or any intention that can disqualify the korban, is only the intention if you're going to hold that eino l'shchita ela basoif at the final intention. So that's number one. Now, why is that important? So what goes without saying is that we just had a few daf ago the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi, whether we say tfois lashon nishain or whether we say af bigmar dvarav adam nispas. Rabbi Meir is the one that says tfois lashon nishain. Now we have to bring all of this together. Now there's another nuance before we bring it all together, and that is that not only does Achedim hold eino l'shchita ela basoif, not only does Rav Meir, which is Achedim, hold tfois lashon nishain, but like Rava says in Masechta Zavachim, the Amar Rava, adayin hi machlokes. What is he referring to? So here's the issue. What happens if it's absolutely clear when a person made two expressions that he really meant to pronounce both as one long declaration? Not in the case that we quoted in Tmuras Oila, Tmuras Shlamim. No, if we know clearly the person is making one declaration, no one can say two words at the same time. Rava holds in Zvachim that I don't care what is the scenario, what we understand to be the intention of the declarer. We always say that only twice lashon nishan. And therefore, now bring it all together, being that the intention is only valid, that which you had at the end, and at the end you said, Lamulim v'la arelim, there isn't enough time at that soif to have two intentions. So therefore, if you said arelim and lamulim, by the time you said lamulim, the shchita was over. So it was only an intention for arelim. And that's why Achedim, Rabbi Meir will hold that the korban is invalidated, even though in principle he agrees with the Mishnah that the invalidation that the machshavas, that the intentions that invalidate the korban of the Mishnah Daf Samach Aleph is only a problem if they are the only machshava. But if it's good and bad, it's going to be okay. But ein l'shchita ela basoif. And even though we know that he meant to say arelim and lamulim, I don't care. We look at the moment where intention is of significance, which is at the last moment. At that moment, all he thought was arelim. Now, interestingly, I'm just reading inside Tosfos. If you say tfois lashon nishain, so the question is, why do you have to speak about whether einoi l'shchita ela basoif? Even if yeshnoi l'shchita mitchila v'atsoif, Rav Meir says tfois lashon nishain. So Tosfos, 50 lines from the top of the Amid, and Tosfos, the first Tosfos in the Amid says, Avol, yeshnoi l'shchita mitchila v'atsoif, kiven sheyei shohus l'shneim lochol chaylu tarvayu, and v'lo yomrin and tfois lashon nishain. Even if we're going to go with Shitas Rava, that even we know that the intention of the person is to do it for both. Rav Meir says twice lashon nishain, still you have to have this nuance. That if the act of shchita is legally viewed during the entire cutting, which is a lot more time than the last moment, which means that the intention that this person is saying, la arelim v'lamulim, let's go with Rashi and Tosfos, he's verbalizing this intention, would happen during the shchita, even Rav Meir would be moided that at least here we can consider it a intention that's coming together. But since so we have to focus on one moment. And in that one moment, what did he say then? Arelim. And we don't say that af b'gemar dvar of adam nispas, which would have allowed us to see what he said later. No. We don't care what he said later. So therefore, there's really only one declaration. Either lamulim v'ra'arelim, the arelim is not counted. He meant lamulim, kosher. Arelim v'lamulim, the lamulim doesn't exist. He only said arelim. If you have a machshavas just arelim, then everyone holds that the carbon is not going to be kosher. Hilkach, the third line in the top, higdim mulim la'arelim, then mulim chayli, arelim loy chayli. But if higdim arelim la'mulim, arelim chayli and mulim loy chayli. So is the first approach in the Gemara. And that says the Gemara, either Amar Rabba, or we have on the side Amar Rabba, loy. No. Lo'olam kosavri achedim, yesh noy l'shchita metchila va'atzoif. And like we just read in Tosfos, and here, even following Rava, even following Rav Meir Tfais Lashon Nishain, in such a case where he's intending both for Arelim and Lamulim, then it would still be okay. However, what really happened was something else. He indeed, in his heart, he intends to shechted both for Mulim and Arelim. Now this is going to work very well with Shitas Rashi and Tosfos, that all of the invalidating intentions needs to be verbalized. And what happened was he didn't fully verbalize that which he had in his heart. But v'hoitzi befiv, only Arelim. V'lo hispik loim el amulim. Maybe he said mulim later, but then the shchita was already over. So this is more about another machlokes. Ubaha pligi that Rav Meir saw, and here Rav Meir clearly is referring to the achedim of the Braisa, that loy ba'in and piv v'li b'shavin. One's words and thoughts need not coincide. So even though we know that in his heart he also was shechting it lamulim, what counts is what he said. All he said during shchita, and even if you're going to go that yesh noy l'shchita metchila va'atzoif, all he said during the shchita from the beginning was la'arelim. He also had in mind lamulim. I don't care what he had in his heart. We only care what he verbalized. The Rabbanan hold, no, it's not true. That be'in and pivali by shavin. Things have to be verbalized, but we have to make sure that it coincides with that which he has in his heart. So even though he said arelim, that declaration doesn't mean anything because he really meant arelim and mulim. And kula alma moida again, that a dual intent for all of the disqualifying intentions of the Mishnah Daf Samach Aleph, which includes mulim and arelim, dual intent is good. The only invalidator is if you only had in mind arelim. Fragt die Gemara, hold on. The Sava Rabbi Meir loy ba'in and piv li b'shavin, that's not true. V'reminu, and there's a Mishnah. The Mishnah says, ha mischavin loy mer truma. Person is separating the first separation. He's giving the percent to 2%. It's clear, it's truma. But accidentally he said, this is meiser. Or when he separated the truma, now he's separating another 10%. Again, we see what he's doing. But however, even though he intended and he's separating meiser, but he said truma. There's a lack of piv v'liboy, or b'chlal by any other neder. So, for example, he's saying, he wants to make a vow that this house is usher on me. This house, the blue house to the right, and he accidentally said the green house to the left. But he said the wrong house. Or if he wants to make a neder not to have enough from Reuven, but he said, I'm not going to have enough from Shimon. He wanted to say, we know that's what he intended, but what he actually said is lozeh. So says a Mishnah, this Mishnah is not attributed to Achedim, it's not attributed to Rav Meir, but based on the rule Stam, Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, we are presuming, that's the question here of Rava, that this is Shitas Rabbi Meir, lo yamar klum, at sheyiyu piv v'li boy shavin. So therefore, don't explain the Achedim based on that Rav Meir does not need piv v'li boy shavin, when indeed Rav Meir does. So the final and the third approach is El Amar Abai. Reishem, the Amar, Simon Rishon Lamulim. He's cutting two pipes. So here we have a Chatzi Matin. It means every avodah is a step. The first step is Shchita. But Shchita itself, we're going to divide into two sub-steps. The first pipe, the second pipe. Doesn't matter whether the trachea comes first, whether the esophagus comes first. But when he shechts one siman, he says, this is lamulim. The second siman, he shechts la'arelim, but he doesn't say arelim. He says, af arelim. Then it's great. Why is it great? Because both simanim have in it a intent that's good. Whether it's only lamulim, whether it's mulim and afarelim, everyone holds it's going to be okay. So the besimin sheni nami, since besiche bei mulim, he associated it. He said af la'arelim, af behemshuk to lamulim. So there's always a mulim involved. That's why there's no problem. But here, seifa, which was what we're trying to explain, the amar simin rishon only la'arelim, and then the simin sheni should be lamulim. So even though the siman sheni is only lamulim, but the siman rishon was only la'arelim. The siman rishon haloi pesiche bei mulin, he did not associate it with mulin. Now you can argue, who cares? Between if you add up the first siman and the second siman, which together creates the avoida of shchita, you have both mulim and arelim. I know that. The question is, do you view a chatzi avoida as something significant for itself? And v'Rav Meir l'tamei de omer mefaglim b'chatzi mater. So let's go back to the example we gave in the introduction. So when you're bringing a carbon mincha and you're doing the final step of the avodah, which is the haktara, and the haktara has two parts, that you're being makter the kemitza and you're being makter the levaina. What were to happen if a kohen verbalizes a machshavas chutz lizman when he does either one or the other, not on both? Rav Meir holds at Spiegel. He didn't think that he's going to be eating the shirayim chutz lizman when he did both the kemitza, when he burnt both the kemitza and the levaina. I don't care. Mefaglen b'chatzi mater. So coming back over here, once we view a chatzi of each step as something for itself, so since in the latter case where the first siman was slaughtered only la'arelim is a machsheva, that's poisel. However, Rabbanan l'tamaya the amri ein mefaglen b'chatzi mater. So we have to put together the intention he had by the first siman and the intention he had by the second siman. And I don't care in which order. Point is that it was both lamulim and la'arelim altogether. No matter which way you thought, whichever intention you had first, that's why the Chachamim, which is our Mishnah, does not differentiate and always holds lamurim la'arelim v'lamulim, that the Korban Pesach is going to be kosher. And with this, we conclude the sugya of intentions. And now we are opening up a whole new topic. Like we mentioned, there's two psukim. There's a pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim that reads, Lo sizbach al chametz dam zevchi. Don't shecht on chametz the blood of my carbon. What carbon is that pasuk referring to? It's not written explicitly. In Parshas Kisisa, a few parshas later, it says almost the same. Instead of it saying lo yisizbach, it says lo yisishchat. Lo yisishchat al chametz dam zivchi. But that pasuk continues v'lo yolin chelev chagi ad boiker. There, in Parshas Kisisa, the pasuk explicitly is speaking about Pesach, so we know we're speaking about a Pesach. In other words, there's an isur to shech the Pesach while still in possession of the chametz. Now, there's many nuances that have to be worked out. Who may not be in possession? Where exactly will the chametz be? And if there was chametz, does it invalidate? All of this will be either machlekes tanoim or machlekes in digam amoraim, or we're going to have some machlekes in Yishayim. Okay, so let's begin reading the Mishnah. Hashoichet as HaPesach al chametz, that someone is in possession of the chametz. Let me already give a heads up. This refers either to the kohen who's shechting, if the kohen owns chametz, or if the one who's sprinkling the dam, the kohen, owns chametz, or if any of the bnei chabura for whom you're shechting the Pesach own chametz. Now, where exactly must that chametz be for there to be a violation? That will leave for the Gemara. It's not if a Jew owns chametz. It's not only if the people for whom the Pesach is being brought. It's either the ones offering it, the kahanim, and or the people for whom the Pesach is being brought. Then there's a violation of the loisasa of leisishchat al chametz dam zivchi. Very importantly, Tosfos here at the end, the last Tosfos on the Amud holds, that even when there was a violation of shechting the Pesach while still in possession of chametz, or while chametz was in the azara, we'll see that in the Gemara, the Pesach remains kosher. How does Tosfos know that? You're violating a lav. So Tosfos reviews a rule that we just had 2 daf ago, because since we're learning kachim, and there's a rule in kachim that only when shana olav akasav la'akif, that when God repeats something twice, then it makes it essential. Tosfos holds, interestingly, even though we quoted their 2 psukim, it's not called a repetition. There's only 1 verse, and therefore it's not a terrible thing. You're violating a lav. If you were given hasra, you're going to get malchus. But the Pesach is kosher. We will see clearly today, Samach Gimel Amud Beis, that Rashi disagrees with the Tosfos. It's good to know that. So Rashi holds that whenever there was a violation of the lav of Lisishchat al Chametz Dam Zifchi, then the Pesach itself becomes possible. But the Tanach holds, what does that lav refer to? Only to the Korban Pesach. And indeed, Rashi, right, the first Rashi under Tosfos, Hashoicher is a Pesach al Chametz oive b'loisese. What loisese? Rashi does not bring the pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim. He doesn't bring the loisizbach al chametz dam zifchi. He brings the pasuk from Parshas Kisisa that loisishchat al chametz. And as the Tzlach explains, because on the pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim, we don't know what korban are we talking about. What's the dam zifchi? But again, in Parshas Kisisa, the pasuk ends that the v'lo yolin laboikir zevach chaga pasach. The pasuk at the end is speaking about Pesach. So that's megale that the whole verse is speaking about the korban Pesach. Rabbi Yehuda adds, the Tanach Rabbi Yehuda holds, af hatamid, that not only is one violating this lav during Shchitas HaPesach, but also when you shech the tamid shel bein ha'arbayim, Rashi writes 2 lines under Tosfos, shel bein ha'arbayim the Erev Pesach, that if the Kohanim that did the avodah, not the Yidden, because you're bringing the tamid for all the Jews, it's impossible, right, for the Kohen who's bringing the Talmud in the afternoon to know what all the Jews own. No Jew is owning chametz, and if that is the case, what he's going to be oiven on a lav. Here, by the Talmud, it must mean that the Kohanim that are doing the avodah of Talmud shel bein arbaim, if they have chametz while they're doing the avodah, they are also violating this lav of loisishchat al chametz dam zifchi. And Rab Shimon, let me just say it by heart, applies this pasuk most broadly. Not only does it go on the Korban Pesach, not only does it go on the Talmud shel bein arbaim, but Rab Shimon says any korban that's brought on Pesach, any korban on Pesach during Chalamoid, I'm bringing my korban shlamim. If I own chametz, I'm violating leisishchat al chametz dam zifchi. There's only one nuance, and that is that even Rab Shimon is moided that on Erev Pesach, during the time that you bring the Korban Pesach, which is the 14th in the afternoon, then you are oived on the Loisishchat al Chametz, only connected to the Pesach itself. But during Pesach, any other Korban that's brought will be in violation of Loisishchat al Chametz if, like we mentioned, the Kohen or the person for whom the Korban is being brought owns chametz or has the chametz nearby. Let's read the Mishnah inside. Now, there's many nuances in this Rab Shimon, and that's based on another klal that we learned in Zvachim, that Rab Shimon holds that a shchita that's not kosher, a shchita that's psula, is b'chlal not called shchita. Shchita she'eina ru'uya lav shchita, which means that if a korban is slaughtered and there's another invalidation in that korban, so therefore the shchita is not called a shchita. If shchita is not a shchita, then this lav you won't violate. And this is going to bring us back to Chazer, that which we learned, the amazing halacha, that a korban pesach, shaloi b'zmanoi, if it's slaughtered lishmoi, it's not valid. But if the korban pesach shaloi b'zmanoi is slaughtered shaloi lishmoi, gavaldik, it becomes a shlamim. And again, Rab Shimon, who holds that if you shecht any korban, not out of Pesach, during Pesach, you are also violating the Lisishchat al Chametz if you have the al Chametz. So let's read now what Rab Shimon Shita. Rab Shimon Oimer like this: HaPesach ba'arba asar, like the Tanach. Yes, if you shecht it while there is al Chametz, you're violating. But hold on, another nuance. You are only violating the Lisishchat al Chametz dam zifchi if the shchita of the Pesach otherwise is good, which means it was done lishmai. Then you'll be chayiv malchus. But if someone shechted the Korban Pesach, Erev Pesach, Shaloi Lishmoi, since Shaloi Lishmoi invalidates the Korban Pesach, and like Rashi reminds us that from Chulin, that Rab Shimon holds, Shchita she'ena ru'uya is not called Shchita. It's called you cut the animal. It's called you kill the animal. You didn't shech the animal. And the lav of owning chametz is regarding loy sishchat. So you're going to be potter. Furthermore, Rab Shimon continues, V'shar kol azvachim, all the other karbanos on the 14th, and even though Rab Shimon applies this verse a lot more broadly, but only during Pesach, not on Erev Pesach, not bisman that you bring the Pesach. So all the other karbanos on the 14th, bein lishman, bein shaloi lishman, whether the shechita will be valid or not, even though there's an ownership of al chametz, you're going to be exempt. However, ubemayid, but if you bring other karbanos during the Yom Tov itself, so now again, Rab Shimon l'shitasi that holds shechita she'ein ru'ya lav shechita. If a Korban Pesach is brought l'shmai, on Pesach it's shaloi b'zmanoi, right? And therefore, a Korban Pesach, if you bring it l'shmai, then it's not good. Rab Shimon holds shechita she'ein ru'ya, ein shechita. So therefore, you did not shech that al chametz, you'll be potter. But if you bring a Korban Pesach during Pesach, which is Shaloi B'zmani, and you had in mind Shaloi L'shmai, which renders that into a Shalamin, Rab Shimon holds that any Korban that's brought during the holiday of Pesach, if you own Chametz, guys, if you own Chametz on Pesach, you're being over Balira, Baliyah, independent. It's important to know that. And a Chanami, we're speaking about this lav of L'sishchat al Chametz, aside of Balira, Baliyah, then you'll be Chayiv. Tanach doesn't agree with that. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree with that. Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda hold that this lav is only for Erev Pesach. Tanakama holds only for the Korban Pesach. Rabbi Yehuda adds also for the Korban Talmud Shalbein or Arbaim, but that's it. Rabbi Shimon applies it a lot more broadly. V'shar kol azvachim, bein lishman, bein shaloi lishman. Again, the first Mishnah in Zvachim, any Korban, even if it's brought shaloi lishmai, other than Pesach and Chatos, even though loy alu liba alam l'shem chayva, but it's kosher. If it's kosher, then you can't call it a shechita she'ein ru'uya. That was an act of shechita. If you own chametz l'Rab Shimon, you'll be chayiv. Aside of the chatos, which is like the Pesach, which if you shechted a chatos during Pesach, shaloi l'shma, and that, like the Pesach, is completely invalidated. So since, again, Rab Shimon holds shechita she'ein ru'uya lav shma shechita, so you didn't shecht. But the nakuda of Rab Shimon is that the lav of l'sishchat al chametz dam zivchi goes both on Erev Pesach when you're shechting the Korban Pesach, and it goes to all of the other karbanos during Pesach, as long as it's going to be a valid sacrifice, even if it's going to be loy alu leba'alam l'shem chayva, but it has to at least be a kosher korban. Are we good?
I got a question.
Yeah.
If you followed all the laws that we learned in the dafs about the ownership of chametz, and you don't own any by 11 a.m., then everything is kosher after that. If everybody followed that and then everybody's done with their...
Mark, you're saying very good. So like this, if a person will own chametz when they're not allowed to, there's a machlekes, Rashi holds from noon you'll be over on balira, baliyah matzah, from 100%. No, if someone owns chametz, they're violating that prohibition. This is a add-on. It's independent of. It's not since you are already in violation, you can't add another violation. Another thing, for owning chametz, you're not going to get malchus because you're not doing anything. Slav she'ein by maisa. For shechting the Korban Pesach, malchus will be got because you're doing something. If you were properly forewarned. But there's a lot of more questions that are very open. The Gemara is going to have to clarify. But I just want to review that this is a very important machlekes rishonim, that Tosfos holds that even when this law is violated, the Riva writes, there's no shana olav akasav la'akev, the korban remains kosher. Chevra, Rashi does not hold like that. We'll see that clearly. Rashi holds that the moment we're speaking about the Pesach, if the Pesach was slaughtered al chametz, like you said, aside of balira baliyah matzah, according to Rashi, aside of violating this law, the Pesach itself becomes invalid. Now, exactly who may not own the chametz? So Amar Rab Shimon ben Lakish, La'olam ein chayiv ad sheyehei hachametz, either belonging to the shoichet, the kohen, even though really shchita ksheda bezar. So let's say the shoichet, or to the zoyrek. In other words, the isur is on those involved in the avodah. Now, mind you, Rab Shimon did not mention the other steps, and we're going to get to that more in Amud Beis. Or what happens if there's going to be an act of burning the fats? Rab Lakish did not mention that. He said shoichet, zoyrek, samach gimel were middle of a sentence. You should not read oy le'echa mebnei chabura, or to anyone for whom the Pesach is being bought. So that's step number one. It's very important. Now, I want to just correlate it to Rabbi Yehuda. When Rabbi Yehuda adds to the Tanach, and he says that this lav isn't only regarding the Korban Pesach, but it's also regarding the Tamid Shel Bein Harbayim, Seder Rishonim. There, the Lakish would not say that Echad Mibnei Yisrael, because the Tamid Shel Bein Harbayim is being brought for everyone. We don't say that. No one is saying that. Especially L'Shitas Rashi, what the Tamid, like one Yid, God forbid, owns Chametz, but the Tamid is not going to be valid. No. There, for sure, the Isur Lirab, the Tanach Rabbi Yehuda, is on the Kohanim, but not on all the Kohanim, on those doing the Avodah. But that's a Korban Tzibur. But when it comes to a Korban Yachid, which is a Korban Pesach, a Yachid doesn't mean that there's only one person. There can be 50 people, right, pre-registered to a lamb, but it's being brought for those individuals. Here, it's either the Kohen owning or it's Echem Ebrei HaChabura. And this will not be debated. What Reish Lakish is really coming to add is exactly where must the chametz be for there to be this violation. Reish Lakish holds this is the main nukud of what he's saying. Va'ad sheyehei imoy ba'azara. So the kohen has it in the azara, or the Yisrael for whom the korban is being slaughtered. That yid is in the azara. Don't forget it says lo yisishchat. Listen to the words al chametz. Taich al means over chametz. Mashma, right near, it's nearby, it's over the chametz. So holds Reish Lakish. That means that if I, God forbid, I own chametz, which I should not, I should have gotten rid of it at 11 a.m., I know that, but I didn't. Aside of that, but if my chametz is in my house, according to Reish Lakish, this lav will not be violated. However, the kohen as well. No, it's
it has to be there in the azara.
Yeah, no. First, we have to clarify chametz of whom, and then where should it be? Rabbi Yochanan agrees with the first statement of Reish Lakish. It's not that if any Jew owns chametz, then the Korban Pesach was leisishchat al chametz. No. It's either the kohanim doing the avodah, or more precise, the shoichet, the zoyrek, mebnei chabura. However, he says afal pi she'ein imoy ba'azara, he just owns it. You're also violating this lav. That's a very important machlokes, and now we're going to try to analyze what's underlying this argument. And the first approach will be, maybe they are debating what the word al means. Again, it says leisishchat al, over the chametz. Now, no one says over means over, but how near does the chametz need to be for you to apply the word al? So l'chay b'mayko mifligi says the Gemara, ilema ba'al b'samach komifligi, whether the word al implies nearness. Nearness means in the azara, and that's that Rab Shimon holds al bisamuch, which is why he adds va'achiyei ima ba'azara. And Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with that interpretation of the word al loy be'inan al bisamuch, and this is correct. This is their argument. But if this is the only issue that they are bringing up, then they would not need to argue here. We would already know their opinions because they already expressed that argument in another case. And on our own, we will compare our case to that case. And there's a Mishnah Menachos, which is Gavaldik. Guys, if you remember that when we bring a korban toida, we even learned to some Mesachtos Pesachim. You know, it's a subcategory of a shlamim with many differences. Firstly, a korban toida may only be eaten for one day and one night. Secondly, the korban toida comes along with 40 loaves of bread. Now, when we sanctify those breads, they undergo 2 steps in their sanctification. First, they become imbued with kedushas mamon, right? They're designated to be used for the toida, and they're sanctified, which means that you can't use it for your personal things. But if you want to exchange it, if you want to redeem it, anything that's not imbued with Kedushas Haguf, for example, could be redeemed, and then the other nafkaminas. Now, when you shech the Korban Toida, the act of the Shechita adds to the holiness of those breads. Those breads now become imbued with Kedushas Haguf, with all of the consequences. For example, even if you were to want to pay for it, to redeem it, you cannot. If something is puzzle, then you can redeem it, be poided. But if something is holy and there's no defect in it, if it has Kedushas Haguf, it has to stay the way it is. Now, there, the pasuk also writes the words a few times, quoting one verse that Ashi brings, Al Zevach HaToida, that the breads have to be Al Zevach HaToida. So say machlokes. So they had a machlokes exactly where do the 40 breads need to be for them to become imbued with Kedushas Haguf. So it says in the Mishnah, Hashoichet Toida Lifnim, that if the Korban Toida, the animal was done properly. But guys, I know by me, it says Ulochaima, it's a mistake, Pashut. Velachma, depends what Gemara you're using. But velachma chutz l'chaima, but the breads were outside the wall. Now it's not clear what wall are we talking about. But before we clarify that, the Mishnah says, if the breads are beyond a certain point, then loikadash halechem. Well, the lechem already has kedushas damim. It's not chulin bread, but it will not become imbued with kedushas haguf, with all of the nafkaminas between kedushas haguf and kedushas man. Now, what is the pshat in the Mishnah? Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Lakish. Amai chutz l'chaima. Rabbi Yochanan says, the Mishnah must mean if the breads were outside the wall of Beis Pagi. Now, guys, there are some times that Beis Pagi refers to different things. We understand here Beis Pagi is referring to the city limits. Now, even according to Rabbi Yochanan, that doesn't touch the word al, meaning bisamuch, it doesn't make sense that if the breads are beyond the borders in which it has to be consumed, because kachei kalim have to be eaten inside Chaimas Yerushalayim. If it's beyond Beis Pagi, which will mean over here, outside the walls of Yerushalayim, then for sure it will not become sanctified. It's not in a place where it can even be eaten. But the point of Rabbi Yochanan is, Abul Chutz L'Chaimas Azara, if it's outside the temple complex, as long as it's in Yerushalayim, yet Rabbi Yochanan says clearly, Kaddish, even though the Torah uses the words Al Zevach HaToida, Chalois, etc. Why? Clearly, because Rabbi Yochanan says, Loi Bo'inen Al B'Samach. Rabbi Yochanan touches the word Al. Al doesn't mean that near, doesn't mean that way. However, Rav Shimon Lakish there Menachis is touching. No, the Mishnah means even if those breads are Chutz L'Chaimas Azara, still like Kaddish. Why? Because Reish Lakish holds Alma Bo'inen Al B'Samach. So the Gemara is saying, I get it, that the al is debated between these two Amoraim, but why would they even have to verbalize their argument here if we already would know it from over there? So therefore, the Gemara says, Ella, there is another nuance that is unique over here. It doesn't go against the machlikas of what al means, but there's another layer over here. There's another kanech over here. Ella basra safek mivligi. Oh, now chevre, hasra safek means a questionable warning. When a person is violating a law, and God knows that they knew that they may not do, and they did it, then they violated God's rule. They are amazing. But for a human beis din to punish them by giving them malchus, by flogging the violator, there has to be many preconditions, one of which is that very near to the violation, they needed to be forewarned with all of the details that we have in Masechta Shvuos, whether you have to quote the verse, who does the hasra, there's a whole halachas regarding hasra. Now, what happens if the warning is a questionable warning? You're telling a person, if you have chametz, you'll be violating. Now, guys, if the chametz is in the azara, then it makes sense that an observer will see the kohen, the shoichet, the zoyrek, the chabura. You have chametz here. Hey, you know what? Don't shech the korban, your own chametz. That's called a clear hasra. If a person owns chametz in their homes, how would you warn them? You would have to tell them, guys, if anyone here has chametz, then you'll be violating. That's called a questionable warning. Is that considered a halachic warning or not? So that's the machlokes. That Reish Lakish holds that that hasra safek is hasra. So therefore, I don't care if the chametz is not in the azara. Reish Lakish, aside of the al, meaning besamach, there's another nuance. Reish Lakish holds that hasra safek is not called a hasra. So if you don't know for sure that the ones doing the avodah or the people for whom the Pesach is being brought, if you don't see their chametz, then there's never going to be a hasra. So Benegea Malkis, Benegea that's the Machloikis. So the Gemara says, again, you're right. We're not debating that.
Once again, Rabbi, just to clarify, if there was no Hasra or there's Hasra Suffolk, does that mean that the carbon is still valid, or it's invalid but there's no Malkus?
Very good. So let's go back a second. There's a Machloikis Rashi Toises, which is so Negea. According to Rashi, whenever the lav was violated, then the carbon becomes invalidated. According to Tosfos, even if the lav was violated, doesn't affect the validity of the carbon Pesach. So just to call, you're asking, according to Rashi, even if you hold Asra Safik, lav Shema Asra, but God knows that this person knew, they knew it wasn't a shayk, they knew they own chametz. That's what you're asking. Whether it will invalidate, that's a great question. My understanding of Asra is that it only affects the Beis Din's ability to give a person malchus. But you're asking a question whether, I'm bringing a carbon to God, whether my carbon is valid, according to Rashi, it will invalidate it nonetheless. The person has to be amazed, Danny. That means if I own chametz, but I forgot about this lav, then the carbon will be good. It's a shoygig. But if you're telling me, if you own chametz, and in my mind I said, oy gevalt, I own chametz, I knew that, according to Rashi, the carbon will become invalidated. But malchus I won't get.
So the Kohen goes and checks the thing, everything's with the correct intent, and suddenly he realizes, oh, he's got bread in his pocket. So so according to that, you're saying that it would still be okay because it was a shogeg?
A shogeg, yeah. Shogeg, yeah. You can't evaluate. By the way, again, Tosfos Bechlal argues with Rashi to begin with. Okay, Gavaldik. Let's go back. Now, says the Gemara again, this machloikis is emes, but it's not needed. Because where do we have Rabbi Yechon and Reish Lakish arguing whether Hasra Safik is called a Hasra or not? The Itmar guys, Masech the Shvuos. Shvua she'oichel kikozu hayom. If a person makes a shvuas bitoy, declaring, taking an oath of something that he will do, that's important because then violation is by a inaction. So a person says, I swear that I will eat this bread today. And the person didn't eat it. So both Rabbi Yechon and Reish Lakish say, Malchus the person won't get. Question is why? So there's a machlokes as to why. Rabbi Yechon says, Eino loika. You know why? Because since the violation was through a inaction, there's a klal. Laf she'ein by ma'isa ein like an olive. Right? That's the only reason. However, there's a potential other reason that Rabbi Yechon does not subscribe to, and that is Aval Asra Safik Shema Asra. Now, understand something like this. We learned this in Shavuos. That when let's say I make an oath, I swear I'm eating the bread today. So let's say you want to warn me, you better keep your oath. When you warn me, you better eat it today. You're not. How do you know I'm not going to eat it today? Again, you're telling me that if I won't eat it today, then I'll get flogged. Then I'll be violating. But I will. The only time your warning is a hasras vadai is, let's say it takes me 1 minute to eat it, and it's the last 1 minute of the day. You have to warn me exactly in the beginning of that minute. That would be hasras vadai. But it's very difficult to get that exact moment. And that's why we learned in Shavuos, this is considered the hasras safik. No one will intuit the last moment of the day. And by the way, there's once you are within the minute, it's too late already. You're warning me too late. So this is also a Hasra Safik, but Rabbi Yechon does not use that as a reason for not getting Malchus, because according to Rabbi Yechon, a Hasra Safik, a questionable warning is just fine. If X, Y, and Z, if you won't eat the bread today, you're going to get Malchus, that's fine. However, Rashim Ben Lakish Amar ain't a loika for only because of Asra Safik. Mishum the Havle Asra Safik. The Asra Safik Lav Shema Asra. Aval Lav She'ein By Maisa. Actually, Rabbi Shlokish, if you remember, holds yes like an olive. So again, it's beautiful. We're not making a stira between Rabbi Yechon and Reish Lakish, but we're just pointing out that l'chu'ura, for them to argue here in Pesachim is not needed. So the Gemara goes back to the first. That lo amri, they answered in the yeshiva that lo olam ba'al b'samachumif. Machlokes here is how do you attach the words leisishchat al chametz? They argued already this in Menaches, or reverse. If they argue here, why did they have to argue in Menaches? Because each one is different than the other. Explains the Gemara of Tzricha, both the leisishchat and the dinam of lachmei toida. Because the ifligu only le'inyan chametz here in Pesachim, I would have erroneously said, Havamina, Bahahu, the Ka'amar Rabbi Yochanan, the Loibe in an Al Besamech, because Baruch, here's what you mentioned, because the chametz you may not own anyways. Let's not forget that there's another problem here. Bal Yiro Bal Yamatzah. So you already are a violator. So we're going to be more strict on you. You know, it's owning bread in itself is something of significance. V'haraya, you are oiver bal yiro bal yamatz. Oh, mishum de'isuru. And therefore, I don't care where it is. We learned this in the first chapter. If I own my chametz in my property, I can be in the other end of the world. I'm violating. So
this would be a rationale for Reish Lakish to agree with Rabbi Yochanan?
No. This would be maybe this will be the reason why over here he didn't touch al literally al besamuch, because it makes sense that you should violate this law even if the chametz is in your house. However, avali migdash lechem maybe like kadosh ela b'fnim. Maybe it has to be near the animal. But guys, don't forget, the word al, by the way, means over. It means more than near. So it's like, they're grades, they're grades of this. It's not as al near as al far. No, it depends on the context. Maybe moidel Hashem and lakish, that in an al besamach. Meaning to say that only the i'isagave, only if the breads are inside the azara, then yes, kaddish with kedusha saguf, and the imloy loy kaddish. And furthermore, mida dahava klei shadas. Guys, think about it. One of the ways items in the holy temple become imbued with kedusha saguf is then when they are put inside a holy service vessel. Now, if there's something near the service vessel, does it become imbued with kedusha? No, it has to be inside of it. So there's a logic to say that for the lechem to become holy, it has to be inside the walls of the azara. Oh, and therefore tzricha, that Rabbi Yochanan holds that by the lechem, by menachos, even as long as it's not outside Yerushalayim, then the lechem is kodesh. Now v'iyashminen only liyan migdash lechem. Then I would have said that from fakir havamina bahach kamer Hashem and lakish the al besamech. For the same logic, because since the i'isagave only if it's inside the walls of the azara kaddish, but if not like kaddish, not like we said, be like a kleisharis, aval in chametz. Everyone is agreeing that if I own chametz, I'm violating bal yiro bal yamatza. Why? Because the isuruhu. I'm being over independent of this law that we are addressing now. And so that's why we have to have them both verbalize their argument. Over there in Menachos and over here in Pesachim. Now, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara that Boyi minei Rab Oishaya mi Rab Ami ein loy la shoichet. Now again, Reish Lakish began and Rabbi Yochanan agreed with that statement that who may not have the chametz, both those who are doing the avodah and those for whom the carbon is being brought. He had a question. He says that if the shoichet, which is normally the kohen, does not own chametz, but v'yesh leila echad me'erchabura, ma'u, is there also a violation of this law? So Amalei, sort of Ami responds, mi ksiv loisishchat al chametzecha, loisishchat on your chametz. Was the Torah addressing the shoichet only? No, loisishchat al chametz. In other words, the liability is no matter who owns the chametz, not only the ones doing the avodah, but even the ones for whom the avodah is being done. So Amalei, even for a non-registered person, for anyone, would that be? That would be a stretch, and how would you even know? And that would invalidate all the karbanos. So Amalei, no. That since it says in this pasuk, and we're always focusing for this reason on the pasuk in Parshas Kisisa, loisishchat, and then the pasuk ends v'lo yolin chelev Chagi, right? Again, the sefer the v'lo yolin laboiker zevach chag pasach. So there's the loisishchat v'lo yolin. So therefore, what do we learn from this juxtaposition that loisishchat al chametz hanoch that are able to violate lo yolin? Who is able to violate lo yolin? Only those who are associated with the carbon, right? The kohanim can somehow hold back the meat. The owners for whom you give the meat can, God forbid, not eat the meat. Notes for people that have to be told, don't allow it to overnight. That means that they have the potential to do so. For them, you have the law in the beginning. But other people, that are not associated with this carbon, since the loyalin is not being addressed to them, neither is the Reisha. Beautiful. Amar Rav Papa. Oh. So the Shlakish mentioned Shoichet and Zoyrek. What about after you do the Zrika in the carbon Pesach? The Chalavim and the Eivarim are burnt on the altar. So says Rav Papa, the last narrow line, Hilkach, Hamaktir es Hachelev. And if the Maktir, the Kohen owns Chametz, right? Let a Shlakish in the Azara, let Rabbi Yechanan, I don't care where, anywhere in this house, also over Beloisasem, because he's associated with the carbon. Hoyel v'yeshlam b'alalana seimurim. Reish Lakish didn't mention it, it doesn't matter. Reish Lakish gave two examples. Shoichet, the Zoyrek. Why wouldn't one example be enough? You can always argue because Shchita is Ksheira B'zor. I wanted to emphasize whether it's the Shchita, which is relatively the least avoida of the four, whether it's the Zrika, the Kohen, whether it's B'nei HaChabura, and if Papa adds, he didn't mean to stop it there. Now that's a big chiddush. So the Gemara now says, the first white line, Tanya Kabasa did Papa. No, there's a brisa that substantiates the Shita. It says, Hashoichet in a brisa, Hashoichet is a Pesach halachametz, oiver b'loisasa. Emasai says the brisa is manchahu either la shoichet, like Reish Lakish, or la zoyrek, like Reish Lakish, or la echam b'nei HaChabura, beautiful. By the way, no mention yet of Haktara. However, hoyo le'echad b'soifa oilam, the brisa clarifies that if chametz belongs to any Jew that's not pre-registered, ein zaku kloi, we're not responsible for that. Now, because of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelozeh, of course we are responsible that our fellow Jews should keep the mitzvahs, and in this context, there's no love. And now the brisa continues, ve'echad hashoichet, ve'echad hazoyrek, ve'echad hamaktir chayiv, clearly like Rav Papa. Now, let's go weiter. Avol hamoilik es ha'oif ba'arba asar. Moilik, oif. How does Malika come in over here? So we learned an Amadal of Shitas Rab Shimon that holds that Leisishchat al Chametz doesn't only go on the carbon Pesach, it goes on anyone's personal carbon. However, the Mishnah also clarified, but only from the beginning of Pesach, not on Erev Pesach. We also learned, for example, that even though all karbanos ideally should be brought before the Talmud Shel Bein Arbaim, Pesach is the exception. If you remember, what happens if there was a person that was a Mechusar Kippurim and bird karbanos, and they did not bring the bird karbanos before the Talmud Shel Bein Arbaim? They should bring it afterwards. And we explained, according to one shita, that was only the chatos ha'oif, because you're not burning anything, you're only throwing the dam. So the question is, if the one who's doing melika on a bird ba'arba asar, l'mashal, they're bringing the bird for the Jew that's a mechusar kippurim, for him to be able to have the carbon Pesach done for him. So even though Rab Shimon says that this lav goes on all the other karbanos, but that's only from the onset of Pesach, not on Erev Pesach, and therefore again, eino oiver b'lei klum. So what we see from this brisa is a backup to Rav Papa that adds that it's not only Shoichet Zoyrek, it's also the Maktir, and the logic behind it is because of the smichus, because of the hekesh between Leisishchat and Veloyolin, and yeah, the guy who's doing the Haktara, he had the potential ability not to burn the Emurim. He could have overnighted it. So to him, God is saying, when you do the Haktara, you Kayin, you're not allowed to own Chametz either in the Azana. It's here, guys, that Rashi says, when we're speaking about a Kayin who's being mocked at owning Chametz, Rashi writes explicitly that we're speaking about a scenario where the Shoichet did not own Chametz. And why? Because if the Shoichet would own Chametz, and therefore the lav was violated, and Rashi holds that when this lav is violated, the carbon is not valid anyway, it will be irrelevant if the Makdir had Chametz or not. This is the Rashi that argues with Tosfos. Okay, we have, let's go weiter. There's a brisa that contradicts in two ways the first brisa that we just quoted. Number one. Number two, like we learned in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, that this lav also goes to the Talmud of the afternoon. The Tanach tells Rabbi Yehuda Nish, Lo Yomru Ela b'Pesach Bilvad. Weiter says the brisa. Eimosai, Bisman Sheyesh La Shoichet, Oy La Zoyrek, Oy La B'nei HaChabura. Again, this is mirroring what we learned above. But we're not responsible. Now the Braisa adds, and here we got a problem, a dual problem. Echad ha-shoichet, ve'echad ha-zoyrek, ve'echad ha-moilek, ribono shel olam, ve'echad ha-moilek. That means moilek, even if this is Rab Shimon, but it's a stira because we're speaking about Erev Pesach. Ve'echad ha-mazeh, moilek and mazeh is both in the chat ha-zoyrek. You're chayiv. But at least even this Tana holds, Aval ha-komitzas ha-mincha. And by the way, Kemitza means even if during Pesach, the one who's doing the offering of the Kemitza owns chametz, even let up Shimon, there won't be a violation. Because the Torah says, Lo sishchat. That's, mincha is so out of this, you can't include it. Bird, yeah. Melika, yeah. Kemitza, not. Then it says, Hamakted esoe murim, eino oiver b'loisase. Eino oiver b'loisase. Again, a contradiction. The last line of Nashi. L'chora, bein Pesach b'yudalit, bein b'moyed. So here the Gemara says, just the top line of Samach Dalet, so we have a contradiction. Malika on the first Braisa says that one who performs Malika is not Chayv. We explained that because if it's Erev Pesach, even Rab Shimon doesn't apply this law. The second Braisa says you're Chayv on Malika. Likewise, Haktora Haktora. And that goes to Rav Papa's statement. The first Braisa says that the one who does the Haktora will be violating if he owns chametz. The second Braisa says that Hamaktim in the last line, so you got yourself a contradiction, and that's where, God willing, we're going to take up tomorrow to resolve this. To be continued.
Sure.